Okay then, hello everybody. Welcome back after our brief spring break. We pick up our series on the city in what is really a very natural place. The look and the feel of a city is in no small part produced by the imagination of architects and designers. We want to explore that today with the help of three wonderful faculty members from UST's College of Arts and Sciences. Daniel López-Pérez is Professor of Architecture and a founding faculty member of the Architecture program at UST. He received his PhD from Princeton University and is a specialist in the historiography of modern architecture and its relationship to contemporary questions of technology, design, research, material, and environmental culture. He is active in both professional and scholarly work. In professional practice, Dr. López-Pérez is the founder of Polyhouse, a model for rapid housing to address the nation's housing crisis. And his scholarly work includes authorship of the book, R. Buckminster Fuller, Pattern Thinking, published in 2020. He is the recipient of numerous research grants and awards, including from the Spanish Ministry of Culture and from Mexico's National Council for Culture and Arts. Lisa Smith, who will speak to us first, was educated here at the University of San Diego, where she received her master's in English and is an adjunct professor in the Department of English. Their specialisms lie in the areas of contemporary fiction, literature for children and adolescents, and the Bildungsroman. She has become one of the most important figures in the work of the Humanities Center, indeed, contributing memorably to many series in this landscape endeavor, offering endlessly imaginative seminar classes for our students, and devising one of our most impactful and ambitious projects, the campus-wide Great Reads series, this semester focusing on Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Shannon Starkey received his PhD from UCLA and is associate professor in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Art History. He is co-author of House of the Future, published by Tokyo's Architecture and Urbanism, while his current research looks at the relationship between architecture and land speculation through the post-war master planned development of California City. Dr. Starkey is also the co-curator of numerous exhibitions, including 2 shows at the Max Center for Art and Architecture in Los Angeles. He is a founding member of Future Living Project, an initiative that investigates the future of our domestic environment, and is co-author of the upcoming book based on that research entitled The New Domesticity. It's really exciting to have the three of you here with us as we kick off the second half of the semester. So please welcome to the Humanities Center Professors López-Pérez, Smith, and Starkey. Thank you very much.
Hello. I'm completely delighted to be here again. Brian, thank you very much for the intro and for inviting me again. And Maggie and Lindy, who make all things possible here. Thank you. So I want to start very quickly with a disclaimer. Not an architect, just playing one in the Humanities Center today. So if I say anything egregious, you just pretend that it didn't happen. I am the person who talks about imaginary things here. I talked about an imaginary mountain, an imaginary forest, and imaginary ice at one point. So I am now here with imaginary buildings. Actually, that's a real building, but I'm going to move into imaginary. So I'm going to be talking about J.G. Ballard's High Rise, which is a novel which I brought, but I don't need to do anything with it. So let's, Maggie, This is looking kind of weird to me. Okay, no, it's not. Okay. So, J.G. Ballard, here he is. He was a very interesting writer and a person. He was a novelist and an essayist. He had and still has a very large cult following. I think he defies categorization. Words like experimental, transgressive, prescient, perverse, pornographic, and obscene are often thrown around when describing him. But he is also slyly funny, and his horror is sometimes a little campy, and he's also an extremely fine writer. He's credited with predicting, among other things, Ronald Reagan's presidency, the internet, and social media. No kidding. He is most often described by people who don't know him as a science fiction writer, because that's how he came to writing. But he largely rejected that label. He said very early that what interested him was not outer space, but inner space, which he defined as the fusion of the outer world of reality and the inner world of the psyche. He was, pills just came out of my pocket. Kind of embarrassing. It's really only aspirin, I swear to God. He was born in Shanghai in 1930 to British parents, and he lived a pretty good expat life until he was put in the Japanese internment camp in Lingua from the ages of 11 to 14. He was exposed to much violence and death, and Shanghai and Lingua are the places that haunt and inform all his writing. It's extremely interesting, but I don't have time to talk about that. There, too, he developed a sense of the world as a stage set. Reality is underneath what we see. There is a backstage behind buildings and things and human beings that is sometimes, under the right circumstances, exposed. Do it, okay. Hence, in his fiction, you constantly see the underneath of things, an exposure of a kind of exoskeleton, wrecked cars and planes, empty swimming pools, the human skeleton, the ruins of buildings, constantly over and over in everything he ever writes, these things. What all these things have in common is that they are mostly types of machines or technologies, the human body too. These, he says, are the invented spaces that you see in dreams, but also in highly dislocated realities, such as war zones, plane crashes, derelict buildings, where the observer imposes his own fears and phobias. The high rise of the novel's title will become one of these spaces. Ballard thinks about the increasing melding and merging of humans with our machines and technologies. He saw that as an inevitability and said many of his books are cautionary tales. So to come round to the novel, High Rise, and to architecture, kind of, in literature, it's a commonplace for the house or the castle or the building, whatever, to stand in for the self or the psyche. In a Gothic novel, as in horror movies, we instinctively understand attics with their boxes of old photos and clothes, sometimes wives, as places to store the past. The basement, on the other hand, is the scariest of all. Don't go in the basement. We scream at everyone as they go into the basement in the movie. We know it is the repressed, down below place of things we don't want to see. The traditional or the Gothic house works well as the analog of the self with its unexplored corridors, dark corners, locked rooms, and closets. The Gothic novel forces a confrontation with these spaces, the self. But in non-novel life or in real life, we just keep the doors closed, we don't go in the basement, and all is well. But what if we no longer live in a Gothic mansion or traditional house, but instead move to a giant concrete monolith reaching into the sky filled with light and open plans rather than all those closed doors? Okay, guys. Modernism. This is a real architect. You see the glasses? We know this. If I could have had those, I would have fit in, and it would have been cool. So, where are we? Here's Le Corbusier, the father of brutalism, having a moment right now, because everybody's seen the movie, apparently. New York Times did a big piece the other day about him, which was interesting. It's a style that's characterized by its exposed concrete, geometric forms, and a lack of ornamentation. Le Corbusier felt that the order and rationalism of the high-rise was the answer to the problem of urban sprawl, and that it was a way to decongest the city while augmenting its density. He says, and here it is, in Towards a New Architecture from 1920, modern life demands and is waiting for a new kind of plan, both for the house and for the city. Further, he states, the house is a machine for living in. And if we eliminate from our hearts and minds all dead concepts in regard to the house, we shall arrive at the house machine, the mass production house, healthy, and morally so too, and beautiful. It is a question of building which is at the root of social unrest today, architecture or revolution. He felt that these urban structures would support the health and well-being of their residents, presumably because of all this openness and light. The human interior would correspond to the building becoming clean and open, no more hidden stuff. To all of this, J.G. Ballard replies, maybe, right? And then he writes the novel High Rise in 1975. If anybody has this or finds this copy, you must tell me immediately. It is highly coveted by me. And I can't find one for less than $500, I'm not kidding. So he was very interested in modernism in general, because he felt that England was hopelessly unmodern. And he was initially fascinated with that Le Corbusier machine-like self-containment of the high-rise. However, he comes to see that vision as a failed experiment. He says, architecture is a stage set where we need to be at ease in order to perform. Fearing ourselves, we need our illusions to protect us. Architecture provides us with camouflage, by which he means the aforementioned attic and cellar, the mysterious halls, the locked rooms. For Ballard, these spaces allow us to displace or misplace our anxieties and phobias so that we do not have to think about them or act them out. He continues, modernism lacked mystery and emotion, was a little too frank about the limits of human nature, and never prepared us for our eventual end. So, High Rise, the novel, was inspired in particular by two structures in London. This is Trellick Tower and Balfron Tower, designed by Erno Goldfinger in 1972 and 1963 as affordable solutions to the post-war housing crisis. This is Erno Goldfinger. There's a really good story about him, but I don't have time. But by the mid to late 70s, both of these towers were in trouble. They had no concierge or doorman, and the interior was very accessible, and so they very quickly became crime-ridden and derelict and whatever. You can buy one now in this building if you want. Ballard had also read the architect Oscar Newman's influential Defensible Space, People and Design in the Violent City, written in 1972, in which Newman argues that towers like these encourage antisocial behavior and urban violence. Ballard says that these run-down tower blocks sprung from the drawing boards of enlightened planners who would never have to live in or near them. He also says, life in high-rises seems to me very abstract, and that's an aspect of setting in the novel with which I am concerned, the technological landscape. So Ballard's high-rise, that's not his high-rise, but his high-rise, can be read in many ways. A dystopian horror story, a Freudian battle of the ego and the superego, an allegory of class struggle, or even a vision of the coming of Thatcherite UK. It is a Lord of Flies in the sky. Everyone says that. And like all Ballard's work, it's gruesome and grotesque, pervy, violent, and troubling. It's also good. This is how the book opens. This is the first line of the book. Later, as he sat on his balcony eating the dog, Dr. Robert Lang reflected on the unusual events that had taken place within this huge apartment building during the previous 3 months. This is Tom Hiddleston from the 2016 movie. I briefly played with the idea of putting up the picture of Tom Hiddleston nude sunbathing. Yeah, I know. It's on the internet. It's there. But family friendly. Yeah, so. The high rise of the title is variously referred to as a small vertical city and a city in the sky. It's a 40-story tower with 1,000 apartments, 2 swimming pools, a supermarket, a hair salon, school, a bank, restaurants, and a rooftop concourse. All the residents' needs in this climate-controlled space are anticipated and catered to. It is 2,000 residents, 2,000 people, boxed up in the sky, secure in the shell of the building. It's imaginary, okay? That's why it's so big. The architect, Anthony Royal, the architect, get it? Who lives in the penthouse, confesses that he had always wanted to design zoos, and late in the novel returns to this as he thinks of the residents in their cages. as creatures in a malevolent zoo exhibiting random and ferocious cruelty. He is also later accused by other characters of wanting to challenge the sun and colonize the sky. In this high-rise, instead of the morally uplifting world that Le Corbusier imagines, this house machine, in fact, facilitates a complete mental and social breakdown. The residents regress into primitive atavistic behaviors. They enact all their regressive impulses. The internal struggle of the Freudian structure of the id, ego, superego becomes manifest in the characters Wilder, the documentary filmmaker Dr. Lang, named after R.D. Lang, the anti-psychiatrist, and Royal, the architect, as they play out their desires for survival and dominance. Initially, the residents are thrilled to be there. They begin by having wild parties that last all hours and devolve into crazy and crazier debaucheries. They drink and drug excessively. They hurl things from the top floors onto their own cars. Soon they break down into tribal warfare, tribes being determined by floor and vaguely by social class. The residents begin to destroy the building, dismantling and graffitiing the elevators and throwing trash everywhere. They pillage and they rape and they kill like marauding sky pirates. Finally, they quit leaving the building altogether. All of this behavior is supported and suggested, instigated by the building itself. The building starts breaking down as if the weight of all this unleashed psychosis is too much for it to bear. The electricity selectively goes out and elevators stop working. The architect dismisses this as teething problems. The building settling. The high-rise, in fact, seems to be alive, to have agency. It's a huge animate presence brooding over them, the elevators pumping up and down. The long shafts resembled pistons in the chamber of a heart. This is actually the inside of Trellick Tower. As things get worse, the building is described as less a habitable architecture and more an unconscious diagram of a psychic event. The imposition projection of the human on the house in the Gothic novel here is reversed. The high-rise imposes itself on the humans. The machine structure and the human begin to meld. The need to not repress, make sure I have the right slide, need to not repress every kind of antisocial behavior left residents free to explore any deviant or wayward impulses. They were free to behave any way they wished, explore the darkest corners of themselves they could find. The high-rise was a model of all that technology had done to make possible the expression of a truly free psychopathology. This is from the movie. Jeremy Irons is the superego, and here's Luke Evans is the id. The id, spoiler, is going to kill the superego, and then the id is going to be killed by a band of witch mothers. This is true. This is a machine house, not a house machine. The distinction, the boundary between the interior of the building and the interior of the residence is gone. Both are exposed. Several of the tenants express the feeling that the building exists only in their minds or as an extension of it. It's not the other residents, it's the building, one of them says. Dr. Lang, the ego character, at one point walks away from the building, aware that he is leaving part of his mind behind. The novel devolves into sheer horror and chaos. See the dog. As the destruction escalates, the electricity finally completely fails. The novel tells us that for the residents, the darkness was more comforting, a place where real illusions might flourish. With the darkness returned, as in the Gothic novel, in the house, the Gothic house, the repressed impulses have somewhere to hide again and needn't be acted out. And so things begin to right themselves again. The residents begin to clean up. At one point late in the novel, the aforementioned dog-eating stand-in for Ballard, Dr. Lang, looks down through a hole in his apartment floor into the apartment below and sees a parallel world where the laws of the high-rise are suspended, a magical domain where these huge buildings were furnished and decorated, but never occupied. This is actually for sale in Trellick Tower right now. He also, where was I? Magic domain, blah, blah, blah. He also thinks that the building is an environment made not for man, but for man's absence. This light, open structure, Le Corbusier's new vision of buildings that were going to get to the root of the social unrest, the architecture or revolution, in fact brings on the latter, revolution. Humans and all their messiness can't survive here in these light, open boxes with no place to hide. Ballard says, a new type of person was created by the building, a cool, unemotional personality, like an advanced species of machine. So, to bring all this around somehow and finish, I started thinking, and I want to bring Ballard into the future where he belongs. I started thinking about his fusing of the structure and the human and the machine. And I started thinking about AI, which is a thing I think about a lot, actually, strangely, which is trained on the human brain and contains, apparently, all human knowledge. But where does it live? Where does AI live? Where does your chatbot girlfriend live? Can you go see her? Well, in data centers, right? So these initially apparently were repurposed buildings. They were done to script. They didn't have signage. But now, this is what I've read, they are highly sought after commissions, apparently. This is the biggest one's in China. This one's in Singapore. And this I took off their website. This is what they wrote. We are increasingly reliant on buildings and facilities of pure utility and technology that may serve humanity but are not based on people, which that goes back to that idea of, you know, the building that's not designed for humans or another type of human and all that kind of Ballardian stuff. So, where do I want to go with that? Sorry, I've just lost my whole. So what's inside this building? That is what's inside the building, yeah. If you're fanciful, like I am, it's the human brain, maybe. Inner and outer space melded. This is the disembodied self housed in a building rather than a soft body. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe it's an annihilation of the self. I'm not entirely sure about this. The machine house. Interestingly, I think, when I look at them, even though these aren't designed for humans, they still look like they are. You imagine that you guys don't, I do, that maybe there's people in there. And so I don't know whether that needs or will evolve or change, or maybe it's a failure of imagination, a building that has no people in it. An interesting fact, I think, about these is apparently if there's, you guys probably already know this, if there's a fire detected, they release a kind of gas, or they pull all the gas, they pull all the oxygen out of the room to put a fire out. So humans cannot live there. The building will kill you, in fact, if you're in there at the wrong moment. Apparently now they're trying to modernize it so it sucks it out, so there's 12% oxygen left, so maybe you could survive for, I don't know, a while. So the AI saves itself, and maybe sometimes us. Ballard said, in 100 years, people will be so immersed in their own private worlds that social contact will be absent. A world of increasing abstraction where there will be no human emotions or values. And then he says, when we are vanished, our successors can reconstitute our psychology from our architecture. There's J.G. Ballard having the last laugh in the corner. Thank you. That's that.
Change this. Good. I don't know how when Brian talked, but yeah. It's uncanny. We haven't spoken, and I'll be speaking about some high-rise things. But not since Hugh Ferris here, architect, image maker, / renderer of the urban condition, whose extraordinary images crude clay for the architectural imagination, both literally in rendering something as scientific as setback laws in the city of New York, but also abstractly as capturing the terror and excitement of the sublime figuration of the urban skylines on the right, and most of all, the architectural imagination, sheer love with the city. And I want to revise the title, if I may, of our session, The Architectural Imagination and Its Sheer Love for the City. Has anyone's images had a bigger impact than in our architectural imagination than Madelon Wiersendorp? Surrealist painter, heroine in my dissertation, and dear, dear friend, whose paintings hang in our living room and so profoundly have shaped mine and others' architectural imagination. Thank you, Brian, and the Humanities Center, Maggie and Lindy, for this opportunity and this series, and for inviting me today to celebrate Madeline's images with you. This presentation I dedicate to her and her contributions to our collective architectural imagination, and in turn, how these images prove that there's no greater muse for our collective architectural imagination than the city. Architecture imagination and its love for the city. Madeline Diesendorp, as described by the renowned chronicler of postmodernism, Charles Jenks. And I'm going to, bear with me. Image giver. Madeline was instrumental in giving iconic power to the narrative of delirious New York. Some of her images endlessly reproduced because they captured the idea of delirium. Skyscrapers as zombie race for inquisitive voyeurs, skyscrapers as copulating couples, the Rockefeller Center as Private Dick, bursting into a couple with his intrusive police headlamp, the flabby Goodyear balloon as spent contraceptive device, the grid plan of New York appearing below the bed as the illicit offspring. What was the plot? The hidden life of Manhattanism, the secret life of buildings in their city, a portrayal through objects of sex in the city 20 years before the city discovered sex. As the historian Mark Jarzenbeck has argued, if historiography can be understood as the place where the avant-garde invoke history to legitimize and contextualize their work, a critical historiography is based on the principle that history and the production of art and architecture are only as strong as the historiography that simultaneously critiques them. For me, Madeline's images, in their simultaneous beauty and irreverence, offer us glimpses of this critical historiography. Madeline's images synthesize building projects into a series of surrealist scenes that historiographically challenge the present with the complexity of the historical past, scenes of ecstasy, chaos, cannibalism, delirium, or docile domesticity were enacted through an anthropomorphic animation of monuments from the immediate or ancient past. Scene 1, production. The eruption of the early 20th century city of production, the Statue of Liberty, seduced and eventually trampled over by the Manhattan of the 1920s and 30s, her tablets of civic norms broken into 1,000 fragments. Scene number 2, promiscuity. Two lovers, played by the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building, caught in the act, flagrant délit, by a tower in Rockefeller Center as an analogy to the promiscuity of architects in the 1920s and 30s, picking up historical styles, doing whatever it is that they wanted to do. Scene number 3, called the European avant-garde, the recurring myth of the European avant-garde's redemptive migration to the United States, recreated with an anticlimactic arrival of a curious floating pool at Manhattan shores after a 40-year journey, only to turn around and go back where they came from in sheer disappointment of their actual realization that they have absolutely no agency in controlling the American skyline. Scene number 4, domesticity. The AT&T building, now in 1984, the offspring of that initial affair between the Empire State, 1931, Chrysler Building, 1930, celebrating its birthday, suggesting both the life and death of postmodernism while affirming the repetitive nature of historical cycles. And there's so many embedded references here in Madeline's images. The first architectural biennial hanging in a rope as if it was a candy and birthday party prop. Scene number 5, Manhattanism. Manhattanism emerged as the melting pot of all the isms: futurism, expressionism, surrealism, Dadaism, fascism, Marxism, modernism, an image of our collective architectural imagination in the city, an image of our collective architectural imagination as the city, an image of our collective historical imagination as itself. The city as an architectural manifesto of its most radical self, all there, available for your choosing. And just like that, these manifestos, like Madelon's images, migrated across many book covers without asking permission for them, often without permission, and often rotated and distorted and reinterpreted and clipped fragments of this critical double life of the seriousness and the irreverence of the city, of the American myth, of the American city as a myth and as a reality. There are many episodes of this challenge between the realities of the city and the myth of its many histories. One of my favorite is this moment of imagination by a Louis Sullivan, a very serious architect who designs lots of things that are very important, in an obscure essay, reimagining the freedom of the different histories shaping what could be historical skylines. This was his own city of the captive globe. And yet, the archaeologist Francisco Mujica raises his hand, objects, and claims that American architecture was in fact not Mansard nor Arabian, but rather Mesoamerican. In his travels to Mitla, Tikal, and Huatusco, Mujica discovers that this new Mesoamerican theory must be fixed, must be reoriented. We must fix the vector of time and realign it, and arrives at his own version of his own Mesoamerican mirage in his city of skyscrapers. He does so right at the very moment in which Hugh Ferris, one of our initial protagonists, is himself dealing with this kind of contradiction, right? With the paradox that has to contend with this double life of the city as a skyline of historical monuments, or the city as a crystalline function of the forms of commerce, or the city as a crystalline cave. Glass prisms shaped by setback laws, glass prisms as the latest reincarnation of history, but this time, surrealist, feverish dreams attributed to Dalí as he walks the city of New York inspires Hugh Ferris' Pyramid of Cheops, replacing or coming down at Columbus Circle, claiming that New York has actually never been modern, but rather, on the contrary, it is as old as Egypt, it is as old as architecture itself. And to save this paradox, the New York-based architect and theorist Diana Agrest, she tells us in her article, Architecture of Mirror, Mirror of Architecture, she unpacks this parallel life of the real and the imaginary as a vanishing point of the perception, and I quote, of representation and figuration in a historical sense. For Agrest, the legibility of the figure, not as a metaphoric representation, but rather as a literal reflection, dissolves the building into pure images of messages without a code. In the shift from the representational to the literal, Agrest argues that expressionism is replaced by surrealism. Instead of the building cutting itself against the sky, building and sky are now one, as in Magritte's landscape of surreality. The shift from a representation based on recognizable historical and disciplinary codes to one of a literal recombination of reflections as found images fractured the representational codes that form our reading of the objects, our reading of the skyline. Agrest's interpretation provides an alternative strategy from which to decipher the project's legibility vis-a-vis its states of fragmentation and discontinuity characteristic of postmodernism. Another episode of this double life was recorded by the French journal L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, the largest professional architectural journal in France, that imagined this, right? Rather than having very big buildings on its cover, it's as normally accustomed to, takes one of Madelon's images, puts it on its side, and reprints it as a cover. Its editor warning us that American architects have fallen prey to two separate consumer systems. One entirely based on market value and construction, and the other entirely based on serving an art market that serves the speculative enjoyment of the collector of the museum. One that operates within the realism of the commercial market, and another within the imaginary musings of an art collector market. Symptomatic of this impasse, and Bernard Hugh is warning European architects, watch out what's happening. Symptomatic of the impasse that arises from these two positions, commercial and paper architecture, Hugh argued that the discipline was undergoing a long, what he called New American, right? American night, darkness, and condemned to perpetually question itself. The City of the Captive Globe is the European anecdote that Hugh publishes in that same very journal. This will save you. And wait a minute. This is Madelon's images, right? Its protagonist, Madelon, and her partner, Rem Koolhaas, were actually inspired by the New York Athletic Club as a planning mechanism built entirely a century earlier back in New York, where the freedom of each floor and the magic of the elevator could juxtapose boxing with an oyster bar. And Madelon's images of the bachelors admiring the similitudes between the oysters and their own gloves embodies this kind of excitement and terror. And it makes me think how boring our mixed-use scenarios are today. The City of the Captive Globe, the City of the Captive Manifesto, that when put together, they cancel each other out, all of the isms, the origins of all of these. The City of the Captive Manifesto of European avant-gardes that could not bring the American city into control. And one final episode of domesticity, the postmodern period where history is finally domesticated. And American architects are doing, and I quote, their own thing. The cover's image we see on Architectural Review, these are all European journals warning us about what's happening, the kind of audacity and out of control. The cover on the image has the AT&T building, the one at the end, alongside two adjacent buildings in a diagonal view that cuts transversely across the Manhattan grid and across time. The Crown Building right up front from 1921, a 25-story French Renaissance tower with a highly ornate pitch mansard roof stood in the foreground. In the middle ground, Trump Tower. In the back, the AT&T. The title of the issue of this Architectural Review, Uses and Abuses of History. Paraphrasing Nietzsche's essay on the uses and disadvantages of history for life, which outlines different perspectives on the role of history in our present. In monumental history, time flows in a continuous process of transformation, and we have landmarks. In antiquarian history, there is no time. The present exists autonomously from the past, based on the received notions of the familiar. And in the critical history, a third model, moments of temporal rupture serve to establish differences between the present and the past, highlighting certain moments but also forgetting others, dissolving certain moments in the past as a way to move on to the future. The dialogue between the past and the present and the past, hinges on one's courage to condemn or forget certain parts of history as a way to embrace and remember others. Nietzsche warns us of the dangers of not condemning and most of all the dangers of not forgetting the past, leading us, what he calls, leading us to a state of oversaturation and ultimately cynicism. At the end, the double life of this critical history leads us to forget and history to repeat itself. Avant-garde manifestos becoming postmodern visions, stories becoming histories, drawings becoming book covers. And today, we continue watching our collective architectural imagination in the city growing ever so wildly and out of control, even in the desert. Can our cities handle so much genius? Not to worry, we are fortunate. We continue to have Madelon helping us make sense of it all. Thank you.
So thanks to Brian and the Humanities Center for inviting me to speak here today. I also have a preface, I guess, because by and large, although I work on architecture, most of the architecture I work on is unbuilt. Rather, I work on designs and ideas that exist primarily as documents, images, drawings. In today's case, I guess, weirdly, I'm going to talk about flowers a little bit. So when I was asked to talk about the city, I wasn't quite sure how to approach it. So I figured I'd start with the relatively simple question of what is the relationship between the architect and the city. It might seem like a natural pairing, the architect and the city. Cities have ample opportunities to design, and the bulk of our 120-ish thousand registered architects in the US have their offices in cities. But architects have also long been fascinated by the city, not just to work in them, but on them. They have theorized the city, such as Corbusier's book here. We did not coordinate talks, by the way, it just worked out that way. And they've also designed the city, often more speculatively than materially. This is a proposed urban plan like Le Corbusier. Site is relatively undefined, multiple sites, pretty much anywhere. In fact, beginning with modernism in the late 19th century, the city became almost an obsession. The building was reconfigured from the primary output of the architect to just one scale of design in a larger spectrum that ended with the city and sometimes the globe. The spoon to the city became a rally cry that reflected the desire to forever expand the scope of the architect. But what exactly is the nature of the obsession? So let's take a look at the city today. The city streams towards us through the media, which is to say we no longer really go to the city so much as view it in images. It's not really a place so much as a mediation. The city is defined by its packaging and its branding rather than its geographical limits. This is not necessarily new, since we already have to be told when we are inside a city. Right? There's city limit signs that tell us when we're in bounds and out of bounds. We have to be told because it's not clear, and there's no physical demarcation. Right? The sign's location is more about legal definition than design. To visit a city today is just to see the original, the hard copy, as it were, right? That confirms all of the images that you've already seen and know. When you visit a city, you scour images, right? Guidebooks, websites, brochures, magazines, pictures, etc. Right? Which is to say, the city is experienced in terms of images. Now, the apparent formlessness of the city is often decried by architects who specialize in lending form to the material world. But the idea of the dematerialized city is not exactly new. In fact, it was a major theme of the 1960s when media theorists were looking at technological progress and conceived of how the city might change. Planning theorist Melvin Weber, heavily influenced by scholars like Marshall McLuhan, claimed that the city is being dispersed through communication systems, what he called the, quote, non-place urban realm. Physical boundaries are becoming irrelevant, and cities are becoming networks rather than sites of density. Your network of friends, colleagues, groups is no longer defined by space. Density needs only be maintained to ease the infrastructural load, like One Wilshire here that you see in the center of the image. This unassuming mid-century office building is today one of a few global internet hubs. Most of the things you access through the internet pass through this building. It is also the largest MMR, just called a Meet Me Room, which is a place where telecommunications companies can connect to each other. The disconnect between space and communication seems to be bad news for the architect, whose near entire discourse is about how to provide space for assembly. And this, obscenely long quote is just to satisfy Brian's love for long quotes on the screen. Zemper here speaks for most architects in his origin myth for architecture in outlining the four elements, a hearth, mound, roof, and enclosure, But it's the hearth that predominates, as he explains how, as a kind of part of the origin story of architecture, architecture existed prior to and indeed enabled language, communication, and sociality. Not all architects are dismayed, however, and historically some have reveled in the idea that architecture isn't just about space, but also communication. Robert Venturi famously argued in the 1960s that the piazza had been replaced by the home television. Here was the new center of social life. In 1968, with his partner Denise Scott Brown, they traveled to Las Vegas with their Yale University design studio. This is her pictured. The results of which were later published in the now infamous book, Learning from Las Vegas, which codified this earlier proclamation. This book is entirely a manifesto against space, an architecture of communication over space, that communication dominates space. And in fact, in Las Vegas, they saw, if you take the signs away, there really is no place. They asserted that architecture, too, is a communication system, a pattern of images inserted into the economy of image flow. Architecture is maintained, just swapped out space for images. The crux of their argument, which they summarized as the decorated shed, is that the combination of a proliferation of images and car travel disconnected space from communication, with the billboard leaping out to the street to broadcast information, paired with an unassuming generic package of functional space sitting in the background, right? Uninteresting. The bulk of their research in the book investigated the nuances of design and the organization of images. In place of urban plans capturing form and space, they register signage. This is their analysis that shows every word that they could read as they drove down the strip. In 1970, 2 years after their Las Vegas studio, but still 2 years prior to the publication of their book, the firm was hired by the Colorado-based conglomerate Great Western United. They're a food services company, to conceive a new master plan and design several buildings for the company's recently acquired real estate development, California City, a nearly 200 square mile town in the high desert north of Los Angeles. The existing development was conceived in the late 1950s when Nathan Mendelsohn, a sociologist turned developer, assembled more than 80,000 acres to master plan a new city that was meant to rival Los Angeles, with a projected population of more than 1 million. Early developments, including a commercial strip and a large park, complete with artificial lake, were supplemented with hundreds of miles of roads, providing access to thousands of primarily single-family residential lots, sold to an international community of investors, some of which did move to the town, resulting in a dotted landscape of sporadically placed homes. In 1969, the company and the development, which boasted tens of thousands of landowners, but only about 1,000 residents, was acquired by Great Western United, helmed by a brash 29-year-old CEO named William White Jr. This commission seemed to offer ideal conditions for Venturi and Scott Brown that had yet to build very much by this point. A largely undeveloped desert site, a young, amenable corporate executive, and a mandate to radically reconceive the present and future development of the city, from graphic design to urban planning. They were also getting paid, in today's dollars, approximately $50,000 a month to do this work. Here was a chance for them to create a true architecture of communication, as they articulated, based on their analysis of Las Vegas. And at first glance, it appears that that's exactly what they did. They designed several projects, but I want to focus on just one in particular, a set of 7 billboards at strategic points along the Cross-City Parkway. The dual sign billboards were modeled on the kind that they found and analyzed in Las Vegas. The high reader sign was designed to be highly graphic and to catch the eye from a distance, while the low reader sign was designed to be informational. And they used non-commercial local desert flowers because, according to Venturi, quote, "We think everyone likes flowers, like motherhood, even us." I want to focus on the high reader sign because here we see evidence of a different kind of communication. What appeared to be a fundamentally commercially driven, eye-catching advertisement mediating buyer and seller, in actuality mediated instead the social environment and the land. The design illustrates a ritual view of communication, which media theorist James Carey articulated as communication directed not towards the extension of messages in space, but towards the maintenance of society in time. The billboards proposed a kind of media environment that imaged the desert landscape and the local ecology to serve as an organizing principle around which scattered investors and homeowners could commune. Scott Brown sourced the imagery of desert flowers from the book Wildflowers of North America, selecting flowers native to the region. In fact, they literally cut out photographic images from the book and pasted them on top of their vellum drawings, the outline of the sign following the edge of the flower image, making the final iteration appear like gigantic artificial flowers with green painted poles. The design highlighted the beauty of the desert, shifting the popular image of the desert as an empty wasteland by focusing on naturally occurring growth. Directed at investors and residents alike, the billboards promoted the existing desert environment in an attempt to dissuade residents from trying to remake the desert into a lush suburban landscape. They communed a social order centered on the beauty and conservation of these flowers. Carey asserted that this second, older, and lesser-known definition of communication is associated not with terms like transmitting or sending, but terms like sharing and fellowship. As he wrote, quote, "Not the act of imparting information, but the representation of shared beliefs." If the archetypal case of communication under transmission view is the extension of messages across geography for the purpose of control, the archetypal case under a ritual view is the sacred ceremony that draws persons together in fellowship and commonality. Where the dominant view of communication involves spreading information, this minor view of communication involves communal gathering. Their billboards propose to cultivate community through a shared appreciation and conservation of the natural beauty of the desert landscape. As Carey wrote, this projection of community ideals and their embodiment in material form, like architecture, creates an artificial, though nonetheless real symbolic order that operates to provide not information, but confirmation, to represent an underlying order of things. The billboards did not provide information, with the exception of the small kind of low reader sign that's very hard to decipher from a distance. Rather, they promote an existing, but as yet unseen order around which the community could coalesce. They propose a collectivizing discourse of desert beauty and conservation that mediates between development and the land. The flower billboards displace the narrative of the city, or the narrative of the desert as a vacuous wasteland to be transformed through architecture. Instead, architecture was mobilized to highlight and conserve the existing desert environment. And interestingly, the flower shows up everywhere. A common in commercial strips, even in their new proposed town hall that has a 30-foot moat of desert flowers planted around it. This is all accommodated by their new urban plan, which saw vast swaths of the original outline of the city restricted from development entirely. This is these big pink kind of curves that carve out spaces beyond which all development would cease for the purposes of cultivating the natural landscape. Architecture mediated the social and the natural through the desert flower, What brings these two things together is the idea that they can both be managed by architecture. And manage is the key term here, because the city is a kind of foreign territory for the architect. And Venturi and Scott Brown are no exception. The city needed to be defined, represented, indeed, as they say, learned from. And while they generated this billboard design very quickly in their kind of 15-month commission, their relationship with the development company changed pretty drastically. They quickly redefined their role beyond design, even beyond master planning, to information management and corporate restructuring. Referencing their own design work, Scott Brown wrote, quote, "We feel, however, an increasing difficulty in checking the validity of that scheme in the absence of a more comprehensive and regular flow of information. We need to know more about day-to-day operations in California City." They argued for, as they put it, planning the planning, which included development and financial strategies, the allocation of resources, the hiring of consultants, and the organization of the planning process itself. They went so far as to propose a new Department of Planning and Design within the corporation, that's P&D, with themselves as heads, working directly under the CEO. Venturi was quite explicit in his ambitions for this role. He wrote, quote, "From setting up new departments, we're reorganizing the corporation." The complex, complicated, disordered, and unknown city, even one that existed more as an idea and on paper than it did in reality, prompted the architects to expand their scope beyond the spoon to the city to the management of the design of the spoon to the city. The urge to design, order, and manage the city begs the question of what historical image is driving this kind of reaction and approach. Well, it turns out, established in early modernism, it's a surprisingly simple, albeit imaginary image. A medium-sized, pre-industrial European city, typically medieval, over a Roman base with a grid, as Le Corbusier pictures here. It has clear fixed boundaries, a defensive wall, and a secure interior. It has a center with a church, government, and marketplace, and the circulation system that expands outward. As Le Corbusier notes, placed in the midst of a chaotic nature, man, for his security, creates and surrounds himself with a zone of protection, in harmony with what he is and what he thinks. He needs a retreat, a citadel in which he feels secure. The contemporary city, by contrast, has lost the relationship between inside and outside, the distance from the wild. Its flows and circulation break through every barrier. The circulation system becomes more and more complex and circuitous. The city itself becomes undifferentiated from undomesticated wilderness. The image of the city as secure, stable, and safe gives way to insecurity. And only momentary stability, like checking your location on GPS with your phone. And even while modernists, including Le Corbusier, denounced the design of this medieval city, they continued to uphold it as a model with its goals of safety, security, and stability. But this idyllic image is largely a myth, right? Because the medieval city was also congested, disordered, dirty, smelly, and dangerous. Which is to say that the city has always been chaotic, disordered, indeed formless, and in that way threatening to the architect. And so, as we might expect, the architect responds with control and management. Thank you.